Hi friends, Tracy here to tell you that making a podcast is hard work. There's research, scripts, editing, and all of that can mean a million decisions. Fortunately for me, my choice in a podcast hosting platform was easy because I decided upon Anchor by Spotify. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your podcast today. Warning: Crescent City Crime contains violent and explicit content that is not suitable for a younger audience. Some topics may be disturbing or triggering for sensitive listeners. Listen at your own risk. Thank you for listening to Crescent City Crime. If you wish to further support the show, please make sure to like, rate, and review this podcast on your preferred listening platform. We can also be found on YouTube at Crescent City Crime. You can discuss episodes with other listeners in our private Facebook group or follow us on Twitter. You can also visit our merch store. All of our social media links, show notes, sources, and more can be found on our blog, nolacrimepodcast.com. That's NOLA, N-O-L-A, crimepodcast.com. We are now on Patreon. On our Patreon, we feature discussions about movies that revolve around crime and offer exclusive merch. If you would like to hear that extra content from us twice a month and access exclusive merch, subscribe to us at patreon.com/crescentcitycrime. We would appreciate it if you help spread the word about Crescent City Crime. Tell a friend or aggressively scream our podcast name at your enemies. The music used in this episode is The Black Fingerprint, and it was composed by Dylan Owen. Welcome to Crescent City Crime, dear listeners. I'm Tracy.
And I'm Brian.
And Brian, what is the holiday that we are recording this episode on?
It's Valentine's Day, of course.
And all this month so far, we've gone on this trajectory of doomed relationships, yeah?
Oh, yes.
You know, in celebration of Valentine's Day in our true crime way, correct?
That's right.
So today is not going to be any different. This is the story of the only woman to ever be put to death by the state in Louisiana. Brian, I think you told me that you at least were a little familiar with this, yes?
Yes, I was familiar with that fact. Pretty sure that was the case when I was studying criminal justice.
Well, her road to the electric chair was short, but it did have many twists and turns, and we're going to get into that today. So we're going to step into our Wayback Machine, and we're going to go way back to the year 1916.
Oh, that's right. Well, it was all the way back there.
I don't even think my grandmother was born yet.
I don't think my father was born yet either.
Oh,
Maybe my
Brian had
grandfather
an
was
older
my grandfather.
dad. Just so everybody knows, Brian had an older father.
Yes, my father was in World War II and Korea and beginning in the Vietnam War. That's when he retired. I was born a few years after my father retired, so I didn't live on any military bases, although I did follow in his footsteps and become a Marine and good on armed conflict as well.
Well, it's pretty weird to think that all of this, in this, I just want to make a note that in this pandemic time, we've heard a lot about the Spanish flu epidemic. That was something that my grandmother was alive during that time. And it's crazy to think that this infamous woman lived before all that even happened.
Yes, a very difficult time of note. Well, not that we'll get into it here, but many laws that we know to be true today didn't even exist back then.
That's very correct, and we are going to get into that quite a bit in future episodes that we have planned.
Sounds good.
So before she changed her name, Toni Jo Henry was born Annie Beatrice McQuiston in Shreveport, Louisiana on January the 3rd, 1916. She was the third of 5 children. When Annie was just 6 years old, her mother died of tuberculosis and she was sent to live with her father and stepmother. Since this was before child labor laws, Toni Jo had no choice but to go to work. She worked in a macaroni factory until she was 13 years old, and she was fired when her boss discovered that her mother had died from tuberculosis.
Of course, yes. She thought that
It was contagious enough to.
Yes.
Yeah. Our understanding of germ theory is a lot better now too.
It is. Oh yes.
Now, what was even worse than that though is that Toni Jo's father was angry and he beat her over losing this job, even though it was not her fault at all.
Wow. Yeah, that's in his case it was likely a channel for anger about something else, as well as anger about losing the job.
Yeah, and this led to Toni Jo starting to exchange sex for money, and at 16 she went to go work in a brothel.
Yeah, that's what it's that's these days you see that as tragic and disgusting. At that time, the attitude was pretty much "c'est la vie."
Yes, it was. That's very true. Like people did not care. It feels like it's only somewhat recently that we've really started to care about what that sort of thing can do to young children.
Because the term "working girl" that goes way back.
Does it?
That goes back a long time.
Oh.
And that comes from a society that previously didn't care if a teenage girl went into prostitution, whereas there was a time when that was normal for underclass teenage girls, which obviously that we were still living in that time then.
Well, we weren't alive then.
Oh, the country was.
Yeah, the country was.
Yeah,
I know what you meant. Yeah. Well, fast forward to 1939, Toni Jo was 23 years old. She was addicted to cocaine, and she was living and working in Austin, Texas, when she fell in love.
Now, of note here, cocaine was not illegal back then.
That's true. A lot of things were not illegal back then.
Coca-Cola still had cocaine in it back then.
And this was after Prohibition. So even during
Wait, hold on, wait. What year are we at right here?
1939.
Yeah, that was after Prohibition.
Yes,
that's correct.
Yeah, that was after Prohibition. And for those who don't know, there was a time when there was an attempt to outlaw alcohol in the country.
Which was a disaster, of course, that created a tremendous amount of organized crime and violent crime. And there were people who wouldn't have otherwise become criminals. Just people who would have just worked in bars. But they wound up in this in the illegal moonshine trade, alcohol and everything, and there were all kinds of crimes that resulted from Prohibition. Like just to name one, for example, burglarizing a National Guard armory to get BARs, Browning automatic rifles, as well as Thompson submachine guns. Whereas, it's like in Hollywood movies, the Thompson submachine guns were depicted as the common gangster long arm, but really the Browning automatic rifle or BAR was more popular.
Is the Thompson the gun that they call the Chicago typewriter?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
But actually, the BAR, the Browning Automatic Rifle, and 308. Was also a full automatic, and it had gangsters had better luck penetrating cars with BARs than Thompsons. But let's move along here.
Move along. Now, it was in Austin, Texas, when Toni Jo fell in love. A prize fighter named Claude Henry, who also went by the nickname Cowboy, was a dedicated customer of Toni Jo's. He fell for the dark-haired beauty, and they married on November 25th, 1939. And I'm going to assume they didn't know each other for very long.
No.
And of course, back then, at the age of 23 years old, Toni Jo was probably kind of being looked at as like an old maid or something, because it was not common for women to be under the age of 25 and not married and have at least one child.
That's true. But to her advantage, that was a time when someone who was considered to be underclass would not see it as beneath them to marry a prostitute.
No, that's true.
Back then,
right?
Since it was more normalized then.
And during their honeymoon in Southern California, Toni Jo was able to overcome her addiction with Claude's help. In a jailhouse interview, she said, "He gave me a home and he got that drug monkey off my back. And that drug monkey is a big, strong thing." And during the same interview, she fondly recalled, "I remember the day I told him I was a cokehead and the look on his face. He thought I just smoked marijuana and grinned. But when I told him my train went a lot further than marijuana, he took me to a hotel room. I lay there in bed for a week, and he would come in now and then and ask me how I was doing. He would slap my face with a cold towel, and we would both laugh." So is that? I'm kind of getting that. Is that like a detox he was doing, just like putting her in a room for a week?
He was secluding her for her withdrawal cycle. Did detox, or a crude way of doing it for the time.
Then, I think there only was a crude way to do it.
Right. By our standards today, is a crude way to do it, but very effective apparently if you're diligent enough.
Well, I actually think that that's really nice. It does sound like at least they seem to like each other.
Yeah.
Now, soon after the happy newlyweds returned to Austin, Claude was arrested for killing Arthur Sinclair in a bar fight. The fight had taken place just before Claude and Toni Jo's wedding day. So he killed this guy, then they went on their honeymoon, and then when they returned, he was arrested.
Yes, apparently.
And
was this, did he bludgeon the other guy to death?
I couldn't find any information, but what I did find is that Arthur Sinclair was a San Antonio police officer. So he killed a police officer in a bar fight.
Even though the police officer was off duty and the dispute did not involve any performance of law enforcement duties. But, we're also still looking at the time when if you killed a police officer, the circumstances did not matter whatsoever.
That is very true. And in January 1940, Claude was found guilty and he was sentenced to 50 years in the Texas State Penitentiary. He escaped the death penalty, which at the time in Texas was hanging, because Arthur Sinclair was off duty. So you were onto something there. Yes, he was off duty.
But even still, under those circumstances, given that it happened in a fight, 50 years by today's standards would be a very stiff sentence.
Yes, and also, 50 years ago, that was hard labor time. You didn't just get to be inside of the very least, like an air-conditioned prison. You were in that Texas sun.
And you were working.
And you were working.
Doing road work or whatever else.
And you were doing all this by hand.
Yeah.
You were doing all this by hand. In fact, if you listeners, if you've never seen this movie, you should go watch Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Because it is kind of a depiction of,
Chain gang.
well, yeah, it does depict a chain gang, but it also depicts just a very little bit of the work that they had to do on a chain gang.
Yeah, so that's when hard labor really was hard labor.
Yes. Yeah, I love that movie. It's one of my favorites.
Whereas, like, for example, like today at Angola, they'll say hard labor, but ironically, it's lucky trustees, prison trustees who get to stay in like a barracks and be the gardeners.
Oh
Grow,
yeah.
grow the grow the vegetables.
Yes.
So you're lucky if you get to be that's prison trustee work in Angola.
Yeah, and I imagine that the prisons back then were probably very, very poorly kept.
Dungeons.
Yeah, like dungeons, and I mean, it's a place you do not want to be. Not that you want to be in prison
You really
now,
didn't
but
want to
you
be there
really
then,
didn't want to be there
especially
then.
then when
Yes.
there was radio existed, but you didn't have it back then.
No.
You definitely, that was before television as well.
Yeah, that's right. You didn't even have TV to look forward to.
Yeah. Whereas, of course, these days there are televisions in prisons, and when you're sitting in a prison, and I know this from working in Orleans Parish Prison myself, the television's your world. If you're sitting in prison, that's your entire world.
And everybody was good because you get TV privileges taken away.
A flip of the switch from the control module, and the TV's off.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always a way to get the inmates' attention, is to turn off the television.
Well, Toni Jo said of Henry Claude's sentence, "When I stood there in the courtroom and heard the judge send him away, it was like it was me they were locking up. I suffered all I could then." That's, and that sounds like a very young love thing to say.
Yes.
Very young love. And I have to say, I really sympathize with poor Toni Jo on this one. Like, imagine that. Imagine like being newly married and boom, sorry, you don't get to be married. He's gonna go to prison.
Yeah, a very, very thin line there. Like, if the officer hadn't died in that fight, then he might have been jailed for a few weeks or a few months.
Maybe,
For
yeah,
for
yeah,
for
for brawling.
Yeah, for brawling, yes. Yeah. And because it's involving an off-duty police officer.
It was Claude Henry's sentence that started the chain of events that would cause his wife to face the electric chair just over 2 years later. As she watched her husband being taken away, she vowed to get him released from prison. However, in this case, getting Claude released meant breaking him out of prison. Devising a plan, she enlisted the help of Finnan Arkansas Burke. Arkansas was a career criminal who had a crush on Toni Jo. She was happy to exchange certain favors for his help. The plan was to rob businesses and use the profits to bankroll the trip to Texas. First, they robbed a hardware store where they acquired 16 guns. They sold most of the guns except for 2 handguns. Their next target was a bank in Stuttgart, Arkansas, but first they needed a better car. On Valentine's Day in 1940 in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and Lake Charles is about how far away from New Orleans, Brian?
It's at least 100 miles.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a ways away, but you could reach it.
It's past Lafayette. It's past Baton Rouge.
Yeah, but you could, like a 4-hour drive ish.
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
So Toni Jo and Burke parked on a lonely highway and waited. Burke was hiding in the weeds, and Toni Jo played the damsel in distress. When a car came along, she stuck out her thumb. Joseph P. Calloway stopped and was immediately pounced upon by Toni Jo and Burke. They pulled him out of the car, tied his hands, and slammed his hands in the door of the car, breaking his knuckles.
They put him in the car and drove a few miles to a rice paddy field. There, on the side of a cold road, they stripped Calloway of his clothing, and Toni Jo took a pair of pliers and put it on the end of Calloway's penis and dragged him towards a haystack in the field. The barbed wire that protected the field tore Calloway's skin. Toni Jo told Joseph P. Calloway to kneel next to the haystack, and she pulled out her gun. After he pleaded for his life and talked about his family, Toni Jo looked him in the eyes, loaded the gun, and told him to pray. Before he could start, she shot him above his right eye. They stole $15 off of his body. They left Calloway's body uncovered and took off in Calloway's car and headed to Arkansas. Really vicious.
It's a very cruel thing to do, just to simply not have you as a witness.
Yeah, and I know that $15 doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but back then that was a pretty good amount of cash.
Well, but back then, $15 could purchase a handgun at the very hardware store
that they stole all the guns from.
They stole all the guns from. As little as $10 back then could have purchased a Coulter Smith & Wesson revolver. Also of note, the hardware stores back then, they sold guns the same as they sold any other tool, pretty much cash and carry, although you had to be an adult.
What was an adult back then for this?
18 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, now back then, you could purchase a handgun at 18 years old from a hardware store.
After witnessing the brutality that Toni Jo was capable of, Arkansas Burke wanted to end the partnership. Toni Jo said of this, "He turned yellow like a little rat. I hit him over the head with the butt of my gun." So she's getting pretty determined here to go through with this plan.
Yes.
And it's escalating too. Again, you can see the chain of escalation.
Yeah, well, you can also see that she already has a thick skin from living the life of a working girl.
A working girl, and before that, she worked in a factory.
That too. Oh,
lost
yes, that's
her
true.
mother, and this is hard living back then. It really was. Like it was hard living. Not at all like the modern comforts we have today. When they reached Camden, Arkansas, Burke left and took the car. Toni Jo returned to Shreveport, which was just a couple of hours away from where Burke left her. Toni Jo tried to hide at the brothel in Shreveport where she used to work, but the madam turned her away and called Toni Jo's aunt instead. At this time, Calloway's body had been found, and law enforcement was looking for the people responsible. Toni Jo confessed to her aunt, who, in turn, contacted her brother, a Louisiana state trooper. Toni Jo Henry was arrested, and she gave a confession to the police. Now, at this time in history, double jeopardy laws were not in effect, so Toni Jo had 3 trials. The first trial was from March 27th to the 29th, 1940, at the Calcasieu Parish.
Calcasieu.
Oh, is it Calcasieu?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Calcasieu Parish Courthouse. The intrigue of a woman who killed a man combined with the sordid details of Claude Henry's trial and Toni Jo's beauty caused a great deal of attention. Even though Toni Jo claimed that Burke was the one who fired the fatal shot, she was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. Toni Jo won a new trial on the claim that the publicity had hurt her case. The second trial took place in February 1941. Unlike in the first trial, this time Burke took the stand and testified against her. She was again convicted and sentenced to death. She appealed and won a new trial once again. The outcome from the jury was the same as the previous times. Only this time she did not win her appeal for a new trial. She submitted a plea of clemency from then Governor Sam H. Jones, which was rejected. While Toni Jo's trials took place, Louisiana's method of execution changed from hanging to the electric chair. While Toni Jo awaited her execution, she was incarcerated at Lake Charles Parish Prison. During her time there, she was befriended by Father Wayne Richard, who baptized her. And during all of this, news of Toni Jo's antics had reached Claude Henry behind bars. Compelled by the need to see her, Claude broke out of prison himself. He intended to break into the Louisiana prison that held Toni Jo, but he was captured before he made it out of Texas.
That's pretty bold. It's
very
bold, pretty determined, and it's quite possible that he may not have believed that she committed the crime, because it's not like
when a man loves a woman.
Yeah, that
she
that
can
and
do no wrong.
That and they hadn't exactly gone around killing people.
No, that's true. They did not.
So to him, this was not the woman he knew.
Very true.
So this drive to break her out of prison was obviously derived from not only his love for her, but a belief that she could not have done what she did. Even though what she did for him, ironically here, was done out of love for him.
Right. Out of love for him and disregard for everybody else. And I just keep thinking back to, like, if she was a damsel in distress and stuck her thumb out for Mr. Calloway, the man that she killed, to me it would make more sense that they try to get money from him some other sort of way, like sexual favors or something like that. He might have been willing to pay. They didn't even. I don't even think they asked him.
In any case, there's a world of difference between robbing someone and murdering and robbing someone.
That's true, but I'm saying they could have done without robbing or murdering anybody.
He might have even not reported it if he'd have only been robbed.
That's true too. Yeah. He might have been like, "Oh, I got duped by a girl. I'm going to hang my head in shame and just pretend like it didn't happen."
Right. Or perhaps back then maybe he would have just concocted some lie that a colored person robbed him.
Oh yeah, back then, yeah, they would have said a colored person, yeah.
And then perhaps and we're talking in terms of back then, some colored person who'd already been in trouble with the law, who was one of the usual suspects, might have been arrested and completely innocent of the crime.
That's true too. I mean, there's a couple of different ways this could have gone, but this is the way that it went, and this is why we're telling the story today.
Yes.
Moments before Toni Jo's execution, she and Claude were allowed to speak by phone to say goodbye. At 12:05 p.m. on November the 28th, 1942, Toni Jo was brought into the basement of Calcasieu Parish Courthouse for her execution. She wore a black crepe dress and black pumps with a red shawl wrapped around her head, and she carried an ivory crucifix. Oh, something that you would not find today is something made out of ivory.
Yes, yeah.
Once she was strapped into the chair, a black cloth mask was pulled over her head. A wet sponge was placed under the leather headpiece, and a leg electrode was placed on her right leg. She prayed for a few moments before the executioner said, "Goodbye, Toni Jo." At 12:10 p.m., 2,350 volts were sent through her body. She was declared dead at 12:12 p.m., and Father Richard was present at her execution and would officiate her burial. Shortly after her execution, Finan Arkansas Burke was also executed in the chair for his role in the murder of Joseph P. Calloway. Not long after Toni Jo's death, Claude Henry was paroled due to ill health. His freedom was short-lived, however, as he was killed by a cafe owner on July the 15th, 1945 in Dallas, Texas. And that is the story of Toni Jo and Claude Henry.
Both meeting tragic ends that resulted from a chain of events started by their love.
Yes, it's very sad.
And bad decisions, of course.
And bad decisions, yes. That never kill anybody. That's a bad decision to do that. Well, I don't want to say never. If it's like life or death defense, then yeah, like you know, if someone's trying to hurt you and kill you, and it's you or them, choose you.
Yes, what I like to say is that life is sacred. Human life is especially sacred. So taking human life is reserved for the most gravest of extremes. I also like the saying choose life, but what it also means is choose your life.
Yeah, choose your life.
And when it comes down to the moment, and you will know when that moment comes.
If it ever comes, you might be lucky and never have to deal with that.
Then instead of saying the word no really loud, no, you don't do that. You channel it with your adrenaline into a vigorated defense of your life, putting everything you have to out there to protect yourself.
Is that? Yeah.
Because if you don't, I mean, there have been many murder victims who just simply yelled no. Wrong. Your energy and your thinking must go into your protecting yourself, possibly escaping if you have the opportunity.
Was that your final thoughts?
Well, my final thought is, yes, don't kill for love.
Don't kill for love. Yeah, that's a very good lesson to be learned from the last few episodes. Don't kill for love.
Yes, and don't, and for that matter, don't kill for diamonds either. You know, like
or a car or $15.
Yeah, right, or
you know,
or for guns.
Yeah, or for guns. Don't do it. Just don't do it. So next week is our monthly break from Murder and Mayhem. And for our second Coffee Talk episode, we are observing Black History Month by discussing Leah Chase, the Queen of Creole Cooking.
Oh, yes. She was such a wonderful, wonderful person. We feel lucky to have met her personally when we dined at Dookie Chase a few years ago.
And we will get into that in our next episode. But for now, dear listeners, I'm going to tell you to be safe, be kind, and don't park next to vans.
And remember, if it's dark and it's dangerous, don't be there in the first place. And if you're being questioned by police and you're not a witness to a crime,
don't say anything.
Lawyer up.